Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our next lesson in our series on the patriarchs. As we discuss the men that God dealt with in Genesis, the people that he made his covenant with, we see how each one of them had an issue that they had to deal with, from Abraham to Lot to Isaac, and now we're discussing Jacob. We see how God was faithful and merciful in giving them an opportunity to overcome the problems that they had within their lives. And last week we began talking about Jacob and how he was a man filled with lies and deceit. That was his failure. That was the issue that God had to deal with Jacob on. And he had deceived his brother. He had deceived his father. He ended up having to flee from his family, and he lost everything, all the connections with his family, as a result of his lies and deception. But the faithfulness of God that we talked about last week was that God showed him the possibility of living in relationship with him, gave him a glimpse of what life with God could be, this staircase to heaven, the ladder to heaven, and showed Jacob that you can have a relationship. And so Jacob tentatively reached out and said, if God will fulfill his promises, then I will make him my God. I will honor him. So the first part of the faithfulness of God to Jacob was that he allowed Jacob to see what life could be lived in relationship with God. But that faithfulness goes on even more to the beginning of chapter 29, and we're not going to read a lot tonight. We'd have to read multiple chapters here. Hopefully you did that before this lesson this week. But in chapter 29, when he gets to Padan Aram, he was sent away from his family to go back to his mother's family in Padan Aram to find a wife who believed in God. And God is faithful to do that, and that Jacob meets and falls in love almost immediately with a woman named Rachel, who is his cousin. It was normal in this time for cousins to marry. And he falls in love with Rachel, who is the daughter of his uncle Laban. Laban was his mother's brother. And he has fallen in love with her so much that he ends up making an agreement with his uncle Laban that he will work for 7 years to be able to marry Rachel. We find this in Genesis 29 and verse 15. And it says, and Laban said unto Jacob, because you are my brother or my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me what your wages will be. And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And Jacob loved Rachel, and said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. And Laban said, it is better that I should give her to you than that I should give her to another man. Stay with me. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him just a few days because of the love he had for her. So Jacob gets to a position of something that he really wants. He wants Rachel. He loves her. She loves him back. They want to be together. He's made this agreement. I will work 7 years for Rachel. And it says it seemed like nothing. When there's something that we really want, time passes quickly. The price we have to pay for it seems like nothing. And that's the case for Jacob. But what we're going to see in this is that God is going to use this situation to remedy Jacob's problem. Remember, Jacob's problem was he was willing to lie and deceive and cheat others to get what he wanted. The way God is going to remedy this is he's going to give Jacob a dose of his own medicine. He's going to have Jacob experience the other side of what he's always done to others. Jacob cheated and deceived and lied to Esau and to Isaac, and now he's going to experience that because he comes up against someone else who's willing to lie and cheat and deceive, and that is his uncle Laban. As we read on in verse 21, notice that he said it seemed like nothing for him to work for Rachel for 7 years. The time was up. And in verse 21, Jacob said unto Laban, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go into her. And Laban gathered together all of the men of the place and made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. And Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah the maid for a handmaid. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. So Jacob is deceived after working 7 years for Laban to marry Rachel. Laban tricks Jacob and gives him Leah instead. Now, how Jacob did not notice it was Leah before morning, it does not say. It's very likely Jacob was drunk at this point because of the big feast that Laban made. Laban made a great preparation. He knew how to deceive. He put everything in place so that Jacob wouldn't notice and would end up with the wrong daughter. And so Laban cheats and tricks Jacob into having Leah. And of course, Jacob is upset the next morning. In verse 25, and Jacob said to Laban, what have you done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? How then have you beguiled or deceived me? Notice how mad Jacob gets about being deceived. How upset do we become when somebody does to us what we do to other people? We can stand almost anything but being treated the way we treat others if we're in a negative situation. If we treat others in a negative way, we hate to be treated in that same negative way ourselves. We see that play out with Jacob. He has deceived others, but once he has that done to him, once Laban deceives him, oh, now we're not going to do this anymore. Now Jacob is upset. Now he's mad. Why have you done this to me? Well, we could ask the same thing. Why did you charge your brother a birthright for a pot of stew? Why did you cheat your father into giving you the blessings? What have you done? We don't see it when we're the ones doing it, but we very clearly see it when it's done to us. We need to learn to get the plank out of our own eye and see the way we are behaving so that we can remedy that. And so this is part of, even though this is a negative thing in Jacob's life, God uses it for a purpose. It opens Jacob's eyes. He starts to see what deception is really like. It goes on in verse 26. Laban said, we don't do it that way in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn. Work another week or 7 years for her, and we'll give her to you also if you serve another 7 years. And Jacob did so, and fulfilled her week or 7 years. And Laban gave Rachel his daughter to wife also, and Laban gave to Rachel his daughter Bilhah his handmaid to be her maid. And Jacob went in to Rachel and loved Rachel more than Leah, and served with Laban yet another 7 years. So Jacob, it was common in this time for people to have multiple wives, and so Jacob marries both Leah and Rachel. Laban actually allows him to go ahead and marry Rachel immediately with the agreement that he will work another 7 years for her. And so Jacob is doing that. If we read on into the next part of chapter 29, remember Jacob really loved Rachel. Rachel was his favorite. And so God allows Leah to have children with Jacob, but does not allow Rachel to have children. He closes her womb so that Leah has multiple children, which were a sign of blessing, which was a sign of prosperity, where barrenness was considered a curse by God. This is again to open Jacob's eyes to the situation. And so over the next chapter and a half, we see almost this battle of the babies between Leah and Rachel as they're each trying to have children, trying to be the favorite wife. And so Jacob ends up blessed by God with 12 sons and at least one daughter as the process of this. he works the 7 years for Laban while all this is going on, and then continues to work for Laban. We can read on in the later part of chapter 30, where after he's worked the 14 total years for his 2 wives, he starts working for payment for Laban. He works for part of the flock, and he at first agrees for the animals that nobody would want, that he would have the animals that were striped or spotted. In those days, you wanted solid color animals so that when you used the fur or the pelts, it was a solid color for the clothing. But Jacob was fine. He said, I'll take the spotted ones or the speckled ones or the striped ones. And God allowed, as a blessing that comes down with that blessing that Isaac had passed on to him, God allowed everything that Laban said. If he said spotted, then all the animals had spotted children. If Laban said striped, all the animals had striped children. So Jacob increased in wealth. He increased in children. He increased in wives. He ended up actually having 4 wives because the maids that during the baby battle were given to him as wives. He ends up having 12, 13 plus children. All of these things are accruing to him. And remember, this goes back to the blessing that Isaac spoke over him that we talked about in the previous lesson, that he would be blessed with material wealth and that he would be blessed with a great family and many descendants. And we're seeing that start here. God is faithful to the promises that he has made. But he's also using this to show him that even though now that his eyes are open, now that Jacob sees what deception looks like, he's able to recognize that Laban is trying to deceive him, because Laban keeps changing the conditions of Jacob's contract, that Jacob is working for him for a certain type of animal, and Laban keeps changing it. But God is faithful to protect him in that every time Laban changes it, God allows those animals to be the ones that are born, so that Jacob's wealth increases and Laban's wealth decreases. So throughout all of this, Laban tries to cheat Jacob, and it goes to show Jacob what deception is like. Often, if we are going to change a behavior, we have to have our eyes open to be able to see what it's really like from the other side. And sadly, for many people, they have to experience the negative side of that. And Jacob's one of those. He had no problem at the beginning of his life cheating others. It wasn't until he was cheated himself that he realizes the problem with it, and he gets angry with Laban. We see him get angry again later on and fuss with Laban about the deception that Laban had practiced on him. We need to think about that in our life. If we find ourselves in a negative situation where we're being mistreated or something bad has happened to us, take a step back. Let's look at our own behavior. Are we on the receiving end of what we have given out to others? If so, it may be the mercy and faithfulness of God to show us where our faults are, to show us what we need to allow God to change in us. And so God is doing that here in Genesis chapter 30 and 31 with Laban. Now, after he has been tricked and cheated by Laban for 20 years, he works 14 years for his wives. He works 6 more years for the flocks. Jacob finally has enough, and he says, I'm going back to Canaan. Yet again, God allowed Jacob to be in this negative situation to force him to a decision that I've got to go back to where I'm supposed to be. Jacob was not supposed to live in Padan Aram. Part of the blessing that Isaac passed to him, part of the blessing that originally was given to Abraham, is that Abraham's descendants and Isaac's descendants and Jacob and his descendants would possess the land of Canaan. He can't possess the land of Canaan if he's in Padan Aram, if he's in a different country. So God allows this negative situation with Laban to occur to force Jacob out, to put him to the point where I am sick of this, I'm sick of being cheated, I'm going to go back home. Now remember, back home there's a man waiting to kill him. Esau, he doesn't know if his father's still alive. If Isaac's dead, Esau has sworn he's going to kill his brother. But Jacob gets to the point where I can't stay here and keep getting cheated. I'll go face Esau. I'm going home. And so he decides to go back to Canaan. He takes his wives and his children with him. That includes not just Leah and Rachel, but also Bilhah and Zilpah, who had been given to Jacob by his wives Leah and Rachel during a childbearing contest. And as a result, Jacob ends up having, like I said, 12 sons, but he also comes to realize that he must have a relationship with God. And this happens on the way back to Canaan. In chapter 31, Jacob basically flees, runs away from Laban. He knows if he doesn't just get out, Laban will not allow him to leave. And so in chapter 31, we see a process of where he severs all ties with Padan Aram. He never goes back there. His descendants never go back there again. Sometimes God will put us into a situation where we have to cut ties. If we're going to inherit the blessings that God has intended for us to have. Remember, Jacob was supposed to live and possess and have Canaan, but he was out in Padan Aram instead. God had to force him out and get him back to where he was supposed to be, and he used negative stuff to do that. God can do the same thing in our life, that there's sometimes we're hanging out, we're living in a place we're not supposed to be. And God will allow negative things to occur in our life to push us out and get us back to where we're supposed to be in relationship with him. To get us back to Canaan. To get us back to the promised place that God has for us. And so, in doing so, he's got to face his brother. And he uses human wisdom. Jacob divides up all of his possessions into different groups, because he says if Esau attacks one group, then maybe the other group will survive and get away, and I won't lose everything. But even more wisely, Jacob lives up to the responsibility of that relationship with God. He makes a prayer. He communicates with God. He builds an altar. And in chapter 32, we see this. In verse 9, Jacob prays. This is the first time we've seen Jacob pray without God starting the conversation. Back when we saw the ladder to heaven, God started the conversation. Now Jacob is initiating the conversation with God in verse 9 of Genesis 32. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, return to your country and your kindred, and I will deal well with you. I am not worthy of the least of all of your mercies and of all of the truth which you have showed unto your servant. Let me stop right there. Here's where we see the change in Jacob. This is where the faithfulness of God has come to fruition in bringing Jacob to where he needs to be. Because Jacob admits, he confesses, repents. He says, I'm not worthy of what you have done for me. I'm not worthy of your mercy, but more than that, he says, of the truth which you have showed me. What truth? The truth of who Jacob really was. In Padan Aram, Jacob learned the truth about lies and deceit and cheating. Sometimes we have to learn the truth, a hard truth, about who we really are and allow God to change that in us. And so now Jacob has seen that difference. He sees the truth that God allowed him to learn. And he goes on to say, for with my staff only I passed over this Jordan, and now I have become two companies. Deliver me, I pray you, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, and that he will come and strike me and the mother with the children. And you said, I will do you good and make your seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. He reminds God of the covenant that God had made. But he prays and he seeks God and he recognizes the relationship he needs with God. And that very night, he sends everybody else on the start of the journey across the river towards Esau. And in chapter 32, verse 24, it says, and Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched the hollow of his thigh. And the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." And Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said unto him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And the man said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince have you power with God and with men, and have prevailed." Notice now, Jacob is actually wrestling, fighting, doing the work himself rather than cheating and deceiving to get what he wants. Originally, he cheated people. He tricked people. He got what he wanted by stealth and by cunning. Now he is wrestling with this angel, or many believe to be a theophany, an appearance of Christ before the incarnation. He's wrestling with him, and he doesn't trick or deceive him. He says to the man, "I will not let you go until you bless me." If we will get that attitude with God, if I'm going to hold on, I'm going to dig in, I will not let go until I have the blessing that I'm seeking from you. And then we have one more trick, and this one comes from God. The last thing that tricks and gives Jacob a taste of his own medicine, that the angel touches Jacob's thigh and knocks it out of joint. And in a sense, tricks him in this wrestling contest and will not let him go. Even so, Jacob still won't let go. He doesn't give up because of that attack. He holds on anyway and says, "I will not let you go until you bless me." And as a result, everything changes. Jacob becomes the person living in relationship with God like he's supposed to. And that is symbolized by a change of his name. Remember from last week we said Jacob meant supplanter, one who takes the place of another by deceit or by scheming. Now it says his name is changed to Israel. Israel means prince with God. God has changed his name, and it shows a change in Jacob's identity. Jacob is no longer someone willing to deceive and cheat people. He is now a prince with God. He stands in relationship with God. He doesn't have to be that old man he once was to scheme his way into what he wanted. He can now be the man that he's intended to be, a prince with right standing and relationship with God. He is reminded of this change because he limps for the rest of his life from where the angel knocked his hip out of joint. And so that limp was a reminder of who he once was, but also who he now is. God can change us the same way. He can take whoever we used to be and the name we used to have, whether that was addict or liar or adulterer or cheater or violent man, or whatever our name used to be, what we used to be known as. And when we give ourselves over and hold on and say, "I will not let go of you, God," he will change us into being a prince with God, a person in relationship with him. And there'll also be a reminder of that change. There are things throughout our life that will remind us of where God has brought us from and where he's brought us to. For Jacob, that was a limp, a hip that was out of joint. For us, it can be who knows what, something that we see in everyday life, or a phrase that we hear, or whatever it may be that makes us think about what God has done for us. So God is faithful not just to change us, but to remind us of the change, to keep before our memory who we used to be versus who we are now. So God remedied Jacob's problem. We don't see Jacob lie and deceive anymore. He is the changed man. He is redeemed. He is brought to the place he's supposed to be. The result of that is when he shows up to face Esau the next day, he finds out Esau has forgiven him. God has been merciful to change Esau's heart, to soften Esau's heart and make him come back into right relationship with his brother. It's another lesson for us. If we'll get our relationship with God straight, it will remedy our relationships with human beings. If we can get the vertical connection right, then the horizontal connections will develop properly also. And so when Jacob quits all the lying and deceiving and lives in relationship with God, then his relationship with his surrounding family is healed as well. At Bethel, God also renews the Abrahamic covenant with Jacob, brings him back to remind him that he is going to receive the land. He's going to receive the blessings that God started with Abraham and passed down through Isaac to him. And we see that Jacob does not just clean up his own life, but he cleans up all the life of his extended family. In chapter 35 of Genesis, we see where Jacob forces or requires his family to get rid of all idols and worship only God. Everybody in the family, the servants, all people have to give up any other gods and worship only the God of Abraham. And so we will eventually see some other issues that rise up in Jacob's life. He had some hot-headed sons that would act violently, and he had to deal with that. But we see Jacob remain faithful to God throughout the rest of his life. In the whole rest of the book of Genesis, as we see Jacob, he doesn't lie again, he doesn't cheat again, he is honest and straightforward and living in relationship with God. This shows us a truth that God is faithful and he changes people. We don't have to remain the same person we are. We don't have to remain who we feel like we've always been. For Jacob, the liar and the cheat became an honest and a faithful man. Jacob dies at 147 years old in Egypt, surrounded by family, blessing his sons and grandchildren. And we'll see more about Jacob as we go on into the life of Joseph. And what we will see in that is how Jacob was changed. God changes us. He doesn't want us to stay who we are. He is faithful to make us into who he intends us to be. So now, after a couple of men in our previous studies that didn't take advantage of the opportunity God gave them, today we've seen how Jacob did. God showed him lies and deceit in his life. He gave him a dose of his own medicine when he was tricked by Laban. And Jacob did not become bitter or angry over that. He allowed his eyes to be opened by God and worked with God to change. He comes back to where he had the experience with God, with the ladder, and he says, "You did what you said you were going to do, and I am submitting to you. I will not let go of you until you bless me." If we can get that attitude, if we can hold on to God and turn away from who we used to be, turn away from what we used to rely on, like lies and deception and cheating for Jacob. If we turn away from what we, in our human nature, did to get what we want, we'll find that the blessings of God are greater than anything we could get through our own struggle and our own attempts. Living in relationship with God brings greater blessing than anything we could achieve on our own. And Jacob learned that. He was changed. We have one more man to talk about in our study, and that is Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob. And we will spend the next two lessons talking about Joseph. And really, I will say, of all of the characters in the Old Testament that we read about, Joseph is probably my favorite. I love to discuss his life and what God does for him. And so it will take us a couple of lessons to get through that. I do ask for the next lesson that you will read Genesis chapter 37, 38, and 39. That's Genesis 37, 38, and 39 to prepare us for what we're going to discuss with Joseph next week. Once again, thank you for being a part of the series, and may God continue to bless you in your walk with him.